Here's another embryo that's very similar, a little better, I think, just a little more advanced. The inner cells, again, are still pretty disorganized, but the cavity is starting to open up a little bit, and the trifecta is starting to become a little more organized. But again, same thing, when we send a video of this embryo out to labs, we don't get good agreement as to what stage the embryo is at, and we don't get good agreement on what the quality of the inner cell mass in the trifecta is. So just simply looking at the embryo and deciding what it is, we don't have good agreement. And you might say that, well, embryos that are advanced like this are hard to score, but when we send embryos out at earlier stages, this is a day 3 embryo right here, we don't even get good agreement on how many cells are in there. And this is pretty sad for us as embryologists because, we can roll this embryo around in culture, we can focus up and down through the embryo, and you would think it would be relatively easy to count. This embryo actually had 10 cells, and you'd think it would be pretty easy to see that, and a lot of labs did get that, but a lot of people aren't able to count the number of cells. We also send out videos of fertilized eggs, and we asked the embryologist how many pronuclei are in this embryo. And again, we focused up and down, we rolled the embryo around, and about 10% of the labs weren't even able to tell us correctly how many pronuclei are in the embryo. And again, that's something that we have to deal with and figure out how we're going to improve that process. Now, when we get to the point of doing the embryo transfer for the patient, and we have some blastocysts in the lab, we then have to decide which embryo we're going to transfer back to the patient. And these are 2 embryos that we had for a patient a couple of weeks ago, and we were looking at these embryos and we were trying to decide which one should we transfer. This one right here is an expanded blastocyst. You see that the zona is pretty thin. So the trifectoderm cells, there are quite a few of them, and they're starting to pump fluid in here to the cavity, so the embryo is very expanded. So nice trifectoderm, nice expansion, it's an advanced embryo, but there's not very many cells in the inner cell mass, and it's not very well organized. If you look at this sibling embryo over here, this embryo has a big organized inner cell mass, very nice inner cell mass, but the trifectoderm is not as well organized as over here. Some of the cells are a lot bigger, and there's not as many of them, and the embryo is not as expanded. So one of the things that I could have asked you guys if you were all embryologists was which embryo you would decide on. And when we were in Barcelona 2 days ago, we had a group of 35 embryologists, and we asked the embryologists in Barcelona which embryo they would pick. And all 35, bar none, picked embryo B. Right? We were in Milan yesterday, and we had 15 embryologists, and we asked the Milan embryologists which embryo they would pick, and 14 out of 15 picked embryo A. Right? So the Spanish and the Italians, I think, have a different approach to choosing which embryos that they're going to transfer. For the record, I was with the Italian embryologist, and this is the embryo that we actually transferred back to the patient. So I think that was the right decision. And I spent some time trying to convince the embryologist in Barcelona that maybe they had made a bad choice. And my reasoning for that was, if we study the way that the inner cell mass is formed in an embryo, it's formed between the 8-cell stage and the 16-cell stage mainly, and then a little more through the cell division from 16 to 32 cell. That's when the inner cell mass and trifectoderm are formed, pretty much. And as the embryo goes through that process, it should generate a total of about 20 to 22 cells in the trifectoderm, and then about 10 or 12 cells in the inner cell mass. So the embryo specifically puts more energy into making trifectoderm as it approaches the time of implantation. That's what the embryo is doing. It's making trifectoderm. And it makes a small number of inner cell mass cells, but that's not the important thing right now. When we go into the uterus, we have to be able to implant, so we need to have a lot of trifectoderm cells. If we don't have enough trifectoderm cells at the 32-cell stage, the embryo can make, up until the 64-cell stage, it can make more trifectoderm cells it can take some cells from the inner cell mass and make more trifectoderm cells, but it can't do the opposite. It can't make more inner cell mass cells. So again, the emphasis is on making trifectoderm. So I think, it's obvious that the embryo is focused on making trifectoderm. I think if there's no inner cell mass, then it's over. You're not going to have a fetus. So you need some inner cell mass, but I think this is where it's at. You need to focus on this at the time of transfer to make sure that the embryo has a good trifectoderm and there's a high likelihood of getting an implantation. So we tend to transfer embryos that have good trifectoderm and an average inner cell mass over embryos with a big inner cell mass and a not so good trifectoderm. And A friend of mine has given me some data from a study that he did. This is from Marius Menkes. He's a well-known embryologist in the US. He works in Dallas. And what Marius did was he took embryos that had trophectoderm of different quality, like, you know, lots of trophectoderm cells, well differentiated or not so good, and he graded the trophectoderm in 4 grades. And these were all embryos that had a good inner cell mass. And he showed that your chance of getting a live birth was directly related to the quality of the trophectoderm. Directly related. Now, when he did the opposite and he looked at the inner cell mass, as long as your inner cell mass was reasonably good, he grades this in 6 different categories, as long as you have a reasonably good inner cell mass, the odds ratio for a live birth doesn't change when you have a good trophectoderm. It's only when the inner cell mass starts to be really, few cells, not very well organized, and really looking bad, that you actually decrease your chance of getting pregnancy. So I think this data supports the fact that you should choose embryos that have a better trophectoderm and maybe not such a good inner cell mass, and maybe not get distracted by those embryos that have a big, nice inner cell mass but no trophectoderm cells. And here are some other studies on this subject if anybody's interested in any further reading. Now, when it comes to freezing the embryos, we're actually pretty loose in which embryos we will freeze, because we think that vitrification doesn't reduce an embryo's chance for implantation. So on day 5, if the embryo looks like it has some inner cells and some trophectoderm, we will go ahead and freeze it. For embryos that don't get to the blastocyst stage on day 6, we're a little more strict, because we think, well, they're a little late getting to this stage, what else is wrong with them? Obviously, if they don't have any inner cell mass, we're not going to put them in the freezer. Just like Dr. Tucker said, we don't keep embryos until day 7 anymore. We think it's over by day 6. And then we use a process called assisted collapse to suck the fluid out of the cavity before we put them into the freezer. So, textbook embryos like this obviously get frozen, but then smaller, less differentiated embryos, as long as we can see some inner cells right here, a little cavity starting to open up, we're pretty happy to put that embryo in the freezer. We think that that's quite a nice embryo. Now, when I show these pictures to embryologists and I say, would you freeze any of these embryos? A lot of embryologists, and including the embryologist in Milan yesterday, said they wouldn't freeze any of these embryos. They don't think that any of them are good enough to freeze. And we would freeze them. This guy right here, he doesn't look great, right? His trophectoderm right here, the cells don't look all that healthy, a little pitted, maybe some vacuoles in there. There's not very many of them, maybe just a very small inner cell mass right here. So this embryo probably doesn't have much of a chance of getting the patient pregnant. But maybe it does have a chance. Maybe there's only a 5% chance that this embryo is going to get you a pregnancy. I think in most situations, if you said to a patient, the embryo doesn't look great, not a very high chance of pregnancy, the patient will say, well, is there a chance? And if you say yes, then the patient will probably say, yes, I would like to freeze it. So we would freeze an embryo like that. We wouldn't freeze this one because it hasn't opened up enough yet. We would wait another day. This is just a morula, which is the stage before blastocyst. We would wait on that guy. This guy we would freeze. Doesn't look great. Again, I'd say the chances are not great that you're going to get pregnancy, but I think vitrification is such a good technology, we're not going to reduce this embryo's chance of giving you a baby by freezing it. So any embryo that has a chance, we're going to put it in the freezer, that we think has a chance. Now, vitrification is a very simple technology. You don't need very complicated equipment. In fact, you just need a heat sealer to close up your little straw. We use these little straws here called cryotips. I'll show you one in more detail in a minute. We use vitrification and warming kits. We have a Hamilton syringe here for loading embryos up into the straws. It's a very simple system. The protocol for vitrification, very simple, very straightforward. 2 solutions involved. The first solution we call the equilibration solution, which has about 15% by volume is cryoprotectant. We use DMSO and ethylene glycol. And then we have our vitrification solution here, which has 15% ethylene glycol, 15% DMSO, make up 30% of its volume as cryoprotectant. And what we do is we take our blastocyst, we put it into equilibration solution right here for 8 minutes, and after 8 minutes we move it into the vitrification solution, and then we load it up into this little straw right here. The embryo gets loaded up and it ends up high up in the straw right here. The straw is very small, it's not much bigger than the actual size of the embryo itself. And having such a tiny straw allows us to cool the straw very rapidly and achieve cooling rates that are somewhere in the region of 2,000 to 6,000 degrees per minute. Now the cooling rate, the rate at which we cool this embryo, determines the rate at which we have to warm the embryo when we come back to thaw that guy out and do a transfer. And we're looking at cooling rates that are somewhere in the region of 10 to the 3 and above. This is propylene glycol, glycerol. And if you go up here and then you look across to see what is the equivalent warming rate that we need when we come to thaw these embryos, you can see that it's pretty high. We have to warm these guys as fast as we possibly can. And you need a big water bath that's at 37 degrees, and you need to get the embryo in there very quickly and get it really warmed up fast so that you get good survival of the embryos and you get the required warming rate. Now, I get emails all the time from people that are doing vitrification and that they're not being very successful with it. This is an email that I got from a lab director in New York City, huge email, 5-page email, explaining to me that they were doing vitrification but it wasn't working very well. And I went through this email, and one of the things I noticed was that when he was rewarming the little cryotips with the embryos inside, he was holding it in air for about 3 seconds before putting it into the water bath. And you're not going to get that very fast rate of warming if you're walking around the lab for a couple of seconds with the straw before you put it into the water bath. And what a lot of embryologists don't realize is that vitrification, we store our embryos down here at the temperature of liquid nitrogen, but the solution that the embryo is in, the vitrification solution, it turns to a glass somewhere in the range of minus 140 or minus 120 degrees Celsius. So down here, the embryo is in glass state. And as you warm up your embryo, warm up your straw, once you get up to about here, the solution in the straw turns back to a liquid, and as you continue to warm it up, you can actually form ice during the warming process and you can kill the embryo. And a lot of embryologists don't realize that during warming that ice can form. People don't think that doesn't make sense. How can you form ice during warming? Well, you can, because you've got this large area here, sub-0 degree area of the scale where you've got to get up through, and you've got to get up through that temperature range very fast so that no ice forms. The warming procedure is a little more complicated than the vitrification procedure. We typically use sucrose, which is an extracellular cryoprotectant to allow the water to go back into the embryo at a controlled rate. So we use a 1 molar sucrose solution and then a 0.5 molar sucrose solution, and then we wash the embryo back into regular medium. We warm and transfer the embryos out here. Typically, if we do a natural cycle frozen embryo transfer, we typically do it out here on day 4 of the natural cycle. If we do a controlled cycle, then we typically do it on progesterone on day 6 for the patients. That seems to work very well. These are our outcomes for the first 2 years. Up here in the top table, what we're looking at are our pregnancy rates with fresh embryos. Right? So these are all patients that had fresh transfers, and in the under 35 age group, you can see we did 117 transfers. We had a clinical pregnancy rate of 48%, and we transferred 1.6 embryos. And 1.6 right here means that 40% of the time we transferred 1 embryo, and 60% of the time we transferred 2 embryos. Over here in the donor program, you can see the number of embryos transferred is 1.4. That means 60% of the time we're transferring 1 embryo. And remember I said in the beginning that we have a bad reputation in the United States for transferring too many embryos? Well, we're trying. We're trying to reduce the number of embryos transferred right here. And the reason we can do this is down here we have our frozen transfers for same patient age groups, and you can see that the pregnancy rates down here with the frozen transfers are very similar, and sometimes they're even better than they are with fresh embryos. So now we can tell our patients, you can put embryos in the freezer. You don't need to transfer all of your embryos right now. You can put them in the freezer, and if you need them, the pregnancy rates are going to be about the same. So don't rush to put too many embryos into your uterus at once.